She was a billionaire with a frozen heart. He was a broke single dad who just wanted to get home. When she slipped into the icy river, he didn't know pulling her out would cost him his peace, and he definitely didn't expect the desperate question she'd ask him next. The wind coming off the river tasted like copper and exhaust. Albert pulled his thrift store collar up over his ears, doing the familiar exhausted math in his head. Rent was due Tuesday. Maya needed a new pair of winter boots because her toes were cramped in her current ones. The transmission on his Ford was grinding in second gear. Life was a spreadsheet of deficits, and he was currently operating completely in the red. He didn't want to look up as he crossed the Hawthorne Bridge. Looking up meant seeing the city skyline, a jagged row of glass needles, where people with uncalloused hands moved money around and called it work. But a flash of camel-colored wool caught his eye. A woman was standing on the pedestrian ledge. Albert stopped. The bridge was practically empty at 2 a.m. He blinked through the sleet, trying to gauge the situation. She wasn't frantic. There was no weeping, no dramatic swaying. She was just standing there, gripping the iron railing, staring down at the churning black water. She wore a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than Albert made in a fiscal year, and dark, sharp trousers. "Hey," Albert called out, his voice raspy from a 12-hour shift at the lumber yard. "Wind's picking up. Not a great place to sightsee." She didn't turn. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a silver lighter and a cigarette. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't strike the flint. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was flat. Dead. "Just taking a breath." "You're on the wrong side of the railing for breathing," Albert muttered, taking a slow step forward. His boots scuffed against the salt-stained concrete. Maybe she meant to step back. Maybe the sleet slicked the steel beneath her Italian leather heels. Or maybe she just decided the effort of holding on was finally greater than the fear of letting go. Her foot slipped. Her fingers lost their grip on the frost-bitten iron. She didn't even scream. She just tipped backward and vanished into the dark. Albert swore, a vicious, ugly word that tore out of his throat. He ran to the edge and looked down. The river was a void 40 feet below. "Not my problem," a cynical voice hissed in the back of his mind. "You have a 6-year-old daughter asleep at Mrs. Gable's house. You can't afford to be a hero." But his boots were already coming off. His heavy canvas jacket hit the pavement. Albert vaulted over the railing. The fall felt like an eternity. The impact was a car crash. The water wasn't just cold, it was violent. It punched the air from his lungs and drove a million icy needles into his skin. Panic spiked in his chest. It was pitch black. He kicked, fighting the heavy, freezing current, his hands blindly sweeping through the muddy water. His fingers brushed something soft. Fabric. He grabbed it, pulling hard, and his knuckles collided with a shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her chest, locking her against him, and kicked frantically for the surface. They broke the water, gasping. Albert choked on the foul, brackish taste of the river. The woman was thrashing instinct, overriding whatever apathy had put her in the water. "Stop fighting," Albert roared, coughing up water. "I've got you! Stop!" He hauled her toward the muddy embankment beneath the bridge's concrete pylons. Every muscle in his body seized and cramped. The cold was sinking into his bones, slowing his heart. By the time his knees hit the sludge of the shoreline, he was seeing grey spots. He dragged her out of the water, collapsing onto his back in the freezing mud, his chest heaving. Beside him, the woman was violently retching, coughing up river water. Albert forced himself to sit up. He checked her over. She was shivering so hard her teeth rattled like marbles in a tin can. Her pristine hair was plastered to her skull, matted with oil and algae. "Ambulance!" Albert gasped, reaching for his soaked pockets, before realizing his phone was in his jacket, up on the bridge. Need to find a phone. No. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wet flannel shirt. Her grip was weak but frantic. No ambulance, no cops. Lady, you just fell 40 feet into freezing water. You're going into shock. I said no. She choked out, her eyes wide and terrifyingly lucid despite the blue tint of her lips. If the board finds out I was pulled out of the river at 2 a.m., the stock tanks. My uncle triggers the morality clause. I lose the company. No hospitals. Albert stared at her. You almost died and you're worried about your stock portfolio. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice cracking as a violent shudder racked her body. Please. Albert wiped his face. He was too tired for this, too profoundly, deeply exhausted. He looked at the steep climb up the embankment, then at the desolate industrial park bordering the river. His apartment building was 3 blocks away. Can you walk? He asked. She nodded once, though her knees buckled the second she tried to stand. Albert caught her. He slung her arm over his shoulder, bearing most of her weight. My name is Albert. He grunted, dragging her forward into the freezing night. Olivia. She breathed, her head resting against his chest. They began the agonizing march through the sleet. Albert's apartment smelled like old radiator dust, cheap laundry detergent, and the lingering scent of boxed macaroni. He practically carried Olivia through the door, kicking it shut with his heel and immediately throwing the deadbolt. He dumped her onto the faded brown sofa. She curled into a tight ball, her knees tucked to her chest. The violent shaking hadn't stopped. If anything, it was worse. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving nothing but the crushing reality of hypothermia. Albert stripped off his soaked overshirt, tossing it onto the linoleum floor of the kitchen. He cranked the thermostat as high as it would go, listening to the pipes bang and hiss in protest. Maya, Albert called out softly, checking the small bedroom. Empty. Right. He had forgotten in the chaos of the night that Maya was sleeping over at her cousin's house. The apartment was entirely theirs. He walked into the tiny bathroom, turned the shower dial to the hottest setting, and pulled 2 threadbare towels from the rack. When he returned to the living room, Olivia hadn't moved. The puddle of river water pooling beneath her on the cushions was getting larger. You need to get out of those clothes, Albert said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Now. The water is sucking the heat right out of your core. Olivia stared at the wall. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in jagged black streaks, making her look like a sad, terrified raccoon. She reached with trembling blue-tipped fingers for the buttons of her wool coat, but her hands wouldn't work. They were too numb. They fumbled uselessly against the heavy tortoise-shell buttons. A frustrated, pathetic sob escaped her throat. The billionaire CEO, defeated by a piece of plastic. Albert sighed, his own teeth chattering. He knelt in front of the sofa. Let me. He didn't wait for permission. He batted her freezing hands away gently and began working the buttons. It was entirely clinical. He peeled the heavy sodden wool off her shoulders, tossing the ruined thousands of dollars worth of fabric onto the floor like a dirty rag. Underneath her silk blouse was plastered to her skin. Bathroom is right there, Albert said, pointing down the narrow hall. Steam was already billowing out into the corridor. Take the rest off. Get in the water. Don't make it too hot right away or you'll burn yourself. Olivia stood up. She looked impossibly small in the dim light of the living room lamp. Albert turned his back, heading toward the kitchen. I'm going to make some tea, and I need to get out of these wet jeans before I freeze to death in my own kitchen. Wait, her voice was barely a whisper, frail and scraped hollow by the cold. Albert paused, hand resting on the cheap laminate countertop. He looked over his shoulder. Olivia was standing in the doorway of the bathroom, the steam rolling over her shoulders. She looked at him with an expression of such profound naked terror that it made Albert's chest tighten. It wasn't the fear of the water. It was the sudden, crushing realization of what had just happened. The sheer, suffocating weight of her own mortality. If Albert walked out of the room, she would be alone. And if she was alone, the silence would let the truth in. She had almost died. Her hands gripped the hem of her wet blouse. "Will you stay if I undress?" The words hung in the humid air. They weren't seductive. There was no coyness, no hidden agenda. It was a plea from a cornered animal, a desperate quiet, begging for a human anchor in a world that had suddenly lost gravity. Albert looked at her. He saw the cynical corporate shark she probably was during the day, entirely stripped away by the river, leaving only a scared woman who didn't want to be left alone with her own thoughts. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a platitude. He just gave a single slow nod. Albert walked into the cramped bathroom. He closed the toilet lid and sat down, turning his body so he was facing the peeling paint of the opposite wall, giving her his profile. He crossed his arms over his damp t-shirt, shivering slightly in the steam. "Go ahead," he said quietly, his eyes fixed firmly on the wall. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Behind him, he heard the wet, heavy slap of ruined silk hitting the tile floor. The shower ran for 20 minutes. Albert sat on the closed toilet lid the entire time, his eyes boring a hole into the chipped white paint of the bathroom door. He listened to the steady drumming of the water against the cheap fiberglass tub. Every few minutes, he heard a ragged, gasping breath, a sharp intake of air that told him she was crying, using the roar of the shower to mask the sound. He didn't say a word. He just stayed put, shivering in his own damp shirt, letting his presence act as the gravity keeping her from floating away. When the water finally shut off, the sudden silence in the small apartment was deafening. "There's a grey towel on the rack," Albert said to the wall, "and some clothes on the counter. They're going to be huge on you, but they're dry." "Thank you," she rasped. Albert stood up his joints, protesting with dull, aching pops, and stepped out into the hallway. He pulled his wet t-shirt over his head, leaving it in a sodden heap on the floor, and grabbed a worn grey hoodie from his bedroom. He threw on a pair of dry sweatpants and walked into the kitchen to deal with the tea. The kettle whistled. He poured boiling water into 2 mismatched mugs, dropping a cheap Lipton bag into each. No honey, no lemon. Just hot, bitter water. He heard the bathroom door click open. Olivia stepped out. She was drowning in his old college sweatshirt. The sleeves hung past her fingertips, and the hem reached her knees. Her dark hair was towel-dried into a frizzy, chaotic tangle. The sharp, intimidating billionaire who had been standing on the Hawthorne Bridge was completely gone. In her place was just a barefoot woman with red-rimmed eyes, holding herself tightly around the middle. "Sit," Albert said, nodding toward the small, wobbly formica table. She sat pulling her feet up onto the chair rungs. Albert slid a mug across the table. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic, closing her eyes, as the heat transferred to her pale skin. "My uncle called a vote of no confidence for Monday morning," Olivia said. The words spilled out of her without preamble. The dam had broken, and now the truth was rushing out into the dingy kitchen. Albert took a sip of his tea. "Okay. My father built the company. Logistics, shipping. We move half the freight on the western seaboard." She continued, her voice trembling, though she fought to keep it level. "When he died last year, the board expected me to sell, to cash out, and let my uncle absorb the assets into his conglomerate. I refused. So he's trying to push you out." "He's succeeding," she whispered, staring into the dark amber liquid in her mug. "He leaked false financial reports, spooked the shareholders. For 6 months I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night. I've fired my closest friends. I've lied to the press. I've turned into a monster to keep a grip on a company that is slipping through my fingers anyway. She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Tonight I looked at the projections. I'm going to lose. Monday morning they'll strip me of everything my father built. And I realized I don't have anything else. No husband, no kids, no friends who aren't on my payroll. Just a giant empty penthouse and a target on my back. Albert watched the steam rise between them. He didn't offer fake sympathy. He didn't tell her it would be okay. "So you went to the bridge," Albert said flatly. "I just wanted the noise to stop," Olivia said, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line down her cheek. "I didn't go there to jump. I just went there to look at the edge, to know I had a choice. But then the wind and the ice." She shuddered, a violent tremor that rattled the table. "When I was falling, Albert, when I was in the air, you realized you didn't want to die." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and haunted. "I realized I had never actually lived." Albert leaned back in his chair. He looked around his kitchen, the peeling linoleum, the stack of unpaid bills sitting under a plastic salt shaker, the crayon drawing of a blue dog taped to the refrigerator. "You want to know what I was thinking about when I saw you on that bridge?" Albert asked. Olivia blinked, wiping her cheek with the oversized sleeve. "What?" "I was thinking that I couldn't afford a tow truck if my transmission finally blew tomorrow. I was doing the math on whether I could skip meals for 3 days so I could buy my daughter a pair of snow boots that didn't pinch her toes." Albert met her gaze, his expression entirely unguarded. "I work 60 hours a week moving lumber. My back hurts constantly. My bank account is a joke. By all corporate metrics, my life is a total failure." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "But when I saw you go over that railing, I didn't think about the bills," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I didn't think about the fact that I was ruining my only warm coat. I just knew that someone was going into the dark and I had to go after them. Because no matter how bad the spreadsheet looks, the breathing part, the waking up the next day part, that's still worth something." Olivia stared at him. The absolute certainty in his voice seemed to anchor her. The panic in her chest, the suffocating pressure of her uncle, the impending board meeting, it all receded, shrinking down to the size of the cheap kitchen table. "Who is she?" Olivia asked softly, looking at the drawing on the fridge. "Maya," Albert said, the hard lines around his mouth softening instantly. "She's 6. Thinks she's a velociraptor most days. She's sleeping at her babysitter's house tonight. She's lucky to have you. She's the only reason I'm still standing." They fell quiet. It wasn't the heavy, terrifying silence of the bathroom. It was a shared exhaustion. Two people who had spent their lives fighting completely different wars, sitting in the rubble together. "You should sleep," Albert said, standing up and taking her empty mug. "You can take my bed. I'll take the sofa." "Albert." He turned around. "I'm sorry I ruined your coat," she said, her voice small. Albert let out a sharp, breathy chuckle. It was the first time he had smiled all night. "Don't sweat it, Olivia. It was ugly anyway." The harsh glare of the morning sun through the cheap plastic blinds woke him. Albert peeled his face off the sofa cushion, his entire body screaming in agony. His shoulders felt like they had been beaten with baseball bats, a parting gift from the river's current. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and looked toward the bedroom. The door was open. Olivia was standing by the window in his kitchen. She had found her phone in the pocket of her ruined coat. Miraculously, or perhaps because Billionaire tech was just built differently, it had survived the water. She was speaking in low, rapid, clipped tones. The CEO was back, I don't care what the penalty is. Freeze the offshore accounts, Olivia was saying, her posture, rigid, her spine, a steel rod. If he wants a war on Monday, we give him a war. Call the legal team. Have them in the conference room by noon. She ended the call and turned around. She caught Albert looking at her. For a second, the iron mask slipped. The ruthless executive vanished, and Albert saw the woman who had begged him to stay in the bathroom. Car's on the way, Albert asked, his voice rough with sleep. My driver is 5 minutes out, Olivia said. She walked over to the table. She was still wearing his oversized clothes, but she wore them differently now, like armor. Good. You should get checked out by a doctor. Secondary drowning is a real thing. Olivia nodded slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek titanium money clip. She unclipped a thick stack of $100 bills, at least $5,000. She set it on the table. For the coat, Olivia said quietly. And the boots for Maya. And the transmission. Albert looked at the money. He felt a hot, dark spike of pride flare in his chest. He stood up, closing the distance between them. He didn't yell. He didn't throw it back at her. He just looked down at her with tired, disappointed eyes. Put it away, he said. Albert, please. I have so much, and you. I said, put it away. Albert's voice was quiet, but it commanded the room. I didn't jump into that river for a payday. I pulled a human being out of the water. Not an ATM, Olivia flushed. Shame crawled up her neck. She snatched the money off the table, her hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. How to owe someone my life. You don't owe me anything. Just go win your war. A heavy knock rattled the apartment door. The driver, Olivia hesitated. She looked like she wanted to say something else to bridge the massive cavernous gap between his linoleum floor and her glass penthouse. But the words weren't there. She turned and walked to the door. Albert, she said, hand on the knob. Yeah, thank you for staying. She walked out, and the door clicked shut behind her. 7 days later, the lumber yard was a dusty, loud purgatory. Albert wrestled a stack of 2x4s onto the flatbed of a delivery truck, sweat stinging his eyes despite the freezing weather. His chest still hurt when he breathed deeply. He hadn't seen or heard from Olivia since she walked out of his apartment. He told himself he didn't care, that it was better this way. She was a creature of a different atmosphere. They couldn't exist in the same space without one of them suffocating. Hey, Artie, his foreman barked over the roar of a forklift. Got a visitor up front for you. Albert wiped his forehead with the back of his canvas glove. He trudged toward the chain-link gate at the front of the yard. A black Mercedes Maybach was parked illegally across 2 loading zones. Standing by the hood wearing a sharp charcoal-grey trench coat and holding a pair of leather gloves was Olivia. She looked immaculate, dangerous. The bruising under her eyes was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp confidence. Albert stopped a few feet away, hooking his thumbs into his tool belt. You're blocking the loading dock. Olivia smiled. It wasn't a corporate plastic smile. It reached her eyes. Hello, Albert. You win your board meeting. I gutted him, she said without a trace of malice, just cold, hard fact. I retained control. The stock is rallying. It was a bloodbath, but I survived. Good for you. Now move the car. I bought the logistics firm that handles this yard's shipping contracts, Olivia said, ignoring his grumpiness. She took a step forward. Their supply chain management is a disaster. The current VP panics every time there's a minor delay. Albert narrowed his eyes. What's your point, Olivia? My point is, I need someone heading my regional operations who doesn't panic. Someone who knows how to keep their head when everything goes completely dark. Someone who knows what it takes to actually move the freight, not just stare at it on a spreadsheet. Albert stared at her. The wind whipped sawdust around their boots. You're offering me a corporate job, pity employment? I don't do pity, Albert. I'm a ruthless CEO, remember? She stepped closer, invading his space, looking up at him with fierce, uncompromising eyes. I'm offering you a job that pays 6 figures because I trust you. I trust your grit. I trust your character. You pulled me out of the freezing water and didn't ask for a damn thing in return. I need people like you in my corner if I'm going to keep this company alive. Albert was silent. His mind raced, calculating the reality of what she was offering. Maya's college fund, a car that worked, a life where he didn't have to count pennies at the grocery store. I don't own a suit, Albert said, finally his voice gruff. We can fix that, Olivia said softly. She reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out money. She pulled out a small, brightly wrapped box with a clumsy stick-on bow. She held it out to him. Albert took it slowly, stripping off his heavy work glove. He pulled the paper back. Inside was a pair of the highest-rated, warmest, most durable children's winter boots on the market. Size 2. For the Velociraptor, Olivia whispered. Albert looked at the boots. He swallowed hard, the cynical hardened armor around his heart finally cracking, letting a sliver of warmth in. He looked up at Olivia, seeing past the billionaire facade, straight to the woman who had trusted him in the dark. I get off at 5, Albert said. You want to meet her? We're having macaroni. Olivia's eyes softened, a genuine radiant relief washing over her face. I would love nothing more. Did Albert make the right choice, trusting Olivia, or is the corporate world going to tear him apart? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. Share it with a friend who needs a reminder about the power of kindness. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, grounded drama stories. Ring the bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next one.